you would teach what Hamas taught in Gaza, which was to teach the young Gazan Palestinians how to join the death cult, to admire it, to be part of it, so that when...
To strive for attainment within it.
For it. It's all very well documented, but the soldiers who were going house to house in 2014, there was a relatively minor war in Gaza compared to this one. And there are many soldiers I spoke to who were involved in the relatively minor conflict in 2014, who were also in Gaza since October 2023. They all said that they noticed when they did house-to-house clearing, going through, trying to find hostages, trying to find weapons, trying to find tunnel entrances, and trying to find the architects of the massacre. They all said the same thing, which was that in 10 years, there was a marked radicalization in the books, in the households, in the learning materials, in everything from, and it's not satire, math textbooks of, if you kill 2 Jews and kill another 2 Jews, how many dead Jews do you have? This is the way you learn arithmetic in Gaza under Hamas. This is something that many of us noticed and had warned about for years. But the fruit of this education system, the fruit of this indoctrination was October the 7th. And look at it. It's been it was a catastrophe for the Israelis, and it's turned out to be an utter disaster for the citizens of Gaza.
There's an immaturity and self-centeredness about psychopathy that's probably intrinsic. So, and it does vary to some degree with temperament. Like, there are violent 2-year-olds, and most of them are socialized by the time they're 4. And the ones who aren't are never socialized. They burn out in their 20s. But immaturity itself is egocentric and pleasure-seeking and power-dominant. And there's no reason to assume that you couldn't maximize that with the proper training. I mean, we train people. Yeah. I know it's a rough realization if your soul is Rousseauian and you believe that there's nothing but good in the heart even of children. And it's not that I have anything against children, and I think they're delightful, but before they're socialized, they're not social.
Yes.
And so it's not that hard to maintain not being social. And then the consequence of not being social is you're alienated, you trust no one. So then you live in a society where, what's it like to live in a society where you can trust no one, where there's no social groupings, where everyone's hell-bent on destruction? Well, it's going to turn you against the world. And that's a temptation to begin with. In the Cain and Abel story, Cain's temptation is to nurse resentment in consequence of the failure of his second-rate offerings, instead of to learn. And he kills Abel, and he fathers the genocidal masses.
Well, this is one of my conclusions about the nature of, specifically of anti-Semitism. It goes back to that Grossman quote, that it acts as a mirror to the failings of the person who suffers from it. So that, for instance, Israel's neighbors could notice that the society is GDP.
The Abraham Accord signatories deigned to notice that, and thank God for some small mercy.
That this country is doing awfully well, considering the existential threat to it constantly from its neighbors since its creation, since literally the minute of its creation in 48.
There's no land except desert. There's no water except
there's no oil.
The sea.
There's no oil. It's the one darn bit of the region where there's no oil. And yet they make a success of it. And if you look around the rest of the region and you see...
colonial enterprise, Douglas.
I know. But you look around the rest of the region, if you were Israel's neighbors in Jordan or Egypt or certainly, Gaza and the Saudi, the Gulf, anywhere, it's a perfect subject for resentment.
They're all victims of the colonial enterprise, right? They bear no responsibility for their own misery.
There's endlessly someone to blame.
That's convenient.
That's very convenient.
Very. And someone to hate. That's even better.
And that's a great unifying thing among much more.
And boy, the worst of your people can really delight in that. And you just have to let them loose and encourage them.
But just think about how this has, how taking the wrong route, Cain and Abel-like,
Yeah.
has been such a disaster.
Well,
for the region.
Cain's descendants are genocidal, and then comes the flood. Right. That's the progression of the story.
Yeah.
And it's causal.
Yes.
It goes from the failure of the individual, the willingness to turn to resentment and bitterness, and then murderous sadism, and then to be the father of the genocidal masses.
That's one of the reasons why, I mean, as you know, I do get theological in this book eventually, because you can't not.
That's the problem with looking at evil.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right.
It's really right. There's.
But it's two things really, Jordan. It's first is that, as you say, I think we agree that it's hard to contend with evil unless you have some kind of theological appreciation of it. But the second thing is, of course, that comes from that is that one of the things I think about in the book is, well, then what's the opposite of that?
Yeah, right. Well, that's the next question that arises, right? That's exactly what would you say? The sequence of thoughts that occurred to me after I spent 20 years studying Auschwitz and the death camps and the Soviet Union and Maoist China. It's like, well, there's hell. There's some way out of that. There's some place that's not that. There's a place that's as far away from that as you could imagine. And there's a pathway to that. Yeah, well, the mythological landscape is the world of good and evil. No doubt about it. So let's turn to the end of your book. That 2 parts, the disconnect, we've covered that to some degree, from defeat into victory. So one of the things that struck me about your book, and I believe this to be the case, is that as Israel goes, so goes the West. The reason that we're all obsessed with that part of the world, when there's many wars we could be talking about, is because, what is it? That's where the tire hits the road.
Yes.
If Israel goes, Europe goes.
Well, that's certainly always been my belief. And some people might say, well, how could a state that's not yet 80 years old be so central to the West? You go, it's not because it's just any other state.
And it's not exactly 80 years old.
No. And so if you begin to contend with what it is the death cults are onto and what their supporters in the West might be onto, when they call for the destruction of Israel, they always do it as a precursor to the downfall of everyone else in the West. And their
You mean like Iran, for example.
Whether it's the Ayatollahs in Iran with the little Satan Israel, great Satan America, Britain, Canada, medium-sized Satans, whether or not it's the Iranian Revolutionary Government doing it for
The protesters are right. Israel is the vanguard of the West.
Well, here's the thing. You see, when students at Columbia, when their group, as well as vandalizing their campus, chasing Jewish students across campus, assaulting janitors and much more, all, of course, in the name of fighting for the oppressed, when they call in their statements for the complete destruction of Western civilization, they do mean it.
The spirit that possesses them means it.
It's just that they recognize that a country of 9 million people in the Middle East, surrounded by countries that wouldn't mind its demise, is an easier thing to destroy than a country of 340 million people like the one we're sitting in.
It's a microcosm of the world.
Right.
You know, because the civilized so-called countries of the world are a tiny fraction of the countries of the world.
Yes.
And so Israel, in its existential condition, replicates the condition of the West in a microcosm.
Yes. And of course, one of the, if not the absolutely central things in the West, which is the tradition of the Bible. The point I'm getting to is...
You talked about that in terms of the celebration of life.
Yes.
Right? Life more abundant, for example.
The point I'm getting to exactly is that when these people, whether it's the protesters in the West or the death cult itself in Hamas, Hezbollah, and others, I think they might have chosen their target well. I think they're onto something. They do know that if you take this out, everyone else is vulnerable next. It's very clever target selection, not just because of size, but because of
Theologically,
what it means.
Absolutely.
What it means theologically. And that's why I get onto this thing that you see, again, it goes back to your thing about how ignorant we are in the West about the reality of evil, among much else, is the presumption that everyone wants what we want, for instance, which, among other things, is also just narcissistic projection. I mean, maybe everyone else doesn't want what you want. Maybe they want something totally different entirely. But one of the
like
things...
their women to be covered from head to toe so they can only see out one eye and never talk. Maybe they want that.
Maybe they want that.
Since they're pursuing that.
And, one of the things I thought of a lot when I was thinking, when I was covering the... Obviously, this is also, as you know, a first-hand account of Israel's response in the conflict. One of the things I thought about a lot was what the spirit is that animates in response to the death cults. Mm-hmm. And I realized that it is, it's there in our texts. It's there in the books.
Therefore choose life.
Therefore choose life. Deuteronomy. Sure. Deuteronomy. Yeah. Choose life that you and your descendants might live. When I was thinking about that, I thought I was reminded of that phase of the new wave atheists in the 2000s, of which I was distantly a part, who used to say things like, well, the Ten Commandments, they're so obvious. I mean, they don't need to, why do we need to be told not to murder? Because you were murdering. Because humankind didn't know that you shouldn't murder.
There's envy. We could talk about envy. If you don't think that's an a priori condition, right, you are very naive.
So I heard that for many years about the Ten Commandments, and it was done in I think, usually naive and flippant way. But when it comes down to this one, literally the commandment to choose life in the face of whatever odds.
Yeah, whatever odds.
As the psalmist says...
That's the story of Job.
Exactly. And as the psalmist says, I shall not die, but I shall live. One of the things that I recount in the book is just the number of examples I came across from people who had stared right in the face of death, right in the face of evil, and who even in the face of it and in the aftermath of it had at the core of their being, I shall not die, but I shall live. And even in a military response, you see the difference between these things. Right,
you talk about Hezbollah breaking apart and everyone fleeing after the leadership is taken out, right? Well, that's why the 100 men possessed of the proper spirit can defeat 12,000 enemies.
Yes.
Because the enemies aren't united by anything transcendent.
One of the things that Hassan Nasrallah, the now late leader of Hezbollah, had said for many years was the jihadist death taunt. He had said it many times. There's a famous time in the 2000s when he says it in a speech in Beirut, when he says, the infidels' great weakness is that they love life. But we love death. And this is our great advantage. He and others around him really meant this. They wanted, just like kidnapping children, kidnapping civilians, they knew that if you go to a society focused on life, even to the extent of the minimization of deaths of their enemies, that if you go for a society that loves life, desires life, fights for life, that you can terrorize them, you can terrify them with your orgiastic celebration of death. But as I described toward the end of the book, as the year of the conflict starts to turn around, as Hassan Nasrallah goes to meet his maker, from a Beirut bunker, when Sinwar finally crops above ground in Rafah, with only 3 other people with him, one, by the way, a bodyguard who was working for the UN, or UN agency. When Sinwar comes above...
UN.
Yes. Again, Sinwar's bodyguard paid for with our taxpayer dollars. But when the architect of the 7th finally comes above ground in Rafah, which, of course, the military expert Kamala Harris had told the Israeli army not to go into because she looked at the maps. But it turned out when they went into Rafah, they found their enemy. And when you see these people, there is an answer to the death cults.